The LA Kings head into the playoffs dealing with some injury issues, but they remain determined. Eddie Garcia of Locked On LA Kings is here to discuss their prospects for the Stanley Cup playoffs. Gil Martin here. The Locked On road to the Stanley Cup continues as we welcome Eddie Garcia, host of Locked On LA Kings, to take stock of the Kings' chances to make a deep postseason run. And Eddie, what would you say is the biggest storyline for the Kings heading into the Stanley Cup playoffs?
Well, unfortunately, I'd have to say it's the health of the team. They had a great regular season. They had the second most wins and second most points ever in franchise history in the regular season. Some people might be surprised by that. So it's been a great regular season. And one of the big reasons for their success has been the overall health of the team. For most of the season, all their key performers were available. Now, there obviously are a few bumps and bruises along the way, miss a few games here and there, but none of their core ever went on long-term injured reserve or anything like that. And that still has been the case late, but there have been a couple of key injuries late that have really affected things offensively and on the power play. Their big offseason acquisition, Kevin Fiala, had been their leading scorer for most of the year, got hurt late in the season. He's missed the last, I think it's 8 games. And he's come back and tried it a few times. I think it's like he's missed like 10 of 13 or something. So he's attempted to come back and play, and then they finally decided, let's just shut you down until the postseason, but he still isn't practicing. And so there's obviously concern. They're not even skating on his own. For Gabe Vilardi, who's been one of the breakout stars this year for the Kings, a young player that has really finally kind of shown the promise that made him a first-round pick. He's also dealing with a lower body injury like Fiala is. And both those guys are such key players on the bottom 6. It might surprise some people that Fiala actually played on the third line, but he's been really good on that third line. And Vilardi's played on the third and fourth line. You take those guys out of the lineup, it really hurts your bottom 6, and it really hurts the second power play unit, because when those two guys are playing on the first unit, then you've got depth players on the second unit. So, for example, Alex Iafallo and Victor Arvidsson now have to play on the top unit with them out, and the second unit really struggles without those guys. When they have them, it's two really good power play units working together. So, unfortunately, the storyline right now for the Kings is, are these two guys going to play? And if so, how effective will they be?
Well, we'll certainly find out, and hopefully they will be available. What's the biggest reason that your team could win the Stanley Cup this year?
Well, I think if you're talking like X's and O's, it's probably team defense. The first half of the season, they had a lot of issues defensively, which was pretty surprising because they're a good defensive team a year ago. Their goal differential before the All-Star break was a -10. And for a lot of the season, they were the only team holding a playoff spot that was negative in the goal differential. But since the All-Star break in the second half of the season, they've really shored that up. Their goals against per game was at 2.55, which was third in the NHL. And their goal differential in the second half of the season is a +31. So they really, really locked things down defensively. And I think their team defense is probably the biggest reason why they could have a deep run. And I think, frankly, if they could beat the Oilers in round 1, I think that proves to themselves that they can beat anyone. I mean, this is an Oilers team. If people haven't paid attention, since March 1st, they have more points and the same number of wins than any team in the NHL, including the Bruins. So this is a team that is playing exceptional hockey right now, but the Kings have played them tight all year. And they've contained their two biggest weapons, Connor McDavid and Leon Draisaitl, and they've also done a great job against that power play for the Oilers. So I would argue the Kings have matched up against Edmonton better than any team this season. If they could beat the Oilers, the amount of confidence that would fill them with going forward, I think they would say, we could beat any other team in the West and get to the Stanley Cup final. It does kind of remind me of 2012 when they went in as an 8 seed. They played the Canucks in the first round, the President's Trophy winners that year, upset them, and went all the way to the Stanley Cup final.
Yeah, and it's going to be strength against strength with the Oilers offense against the Kings defense. How about the biggest reason why the Kings will not win the Stanley Cup?
Well, it is interesting that they'll go stretches of playing phenomenal team defense, like 8, 9, 10 games in a row, allowing 2 or fewer goals. And then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, they will just throw a stinker up. There was a stretch of like 10 games in a row where they allowed 2 or fewer goals, and then they allowed 6 goals to the Blues. And then they went on another run, and then they played Vegas, and they allowed 4 goals in the first period. It's almost like they have to remind themselves by playing badly, oh no, we can't play this way. We got to lock it up. But you can't do that in the playoffs. You have to be consistent game in, game out. You can't have one kind of throwaway game where you just give another team a win. That's not going to work. So I just think they have to, if they can have that consistent, defensive effort for the entire playoffs, or for the most part, like I said, you can't just have some one game out of nowhere where you just collapse. And I'm not sure why that happens. It doesn't make any sense, but can't do that in the playoffs. You've got to be game in, game out, consistent, and hopefully they can do that.
Yeah, margin for error gets a lot less in the postseason. Who would you say is the key player to watch for the Kings?
Well, I mean, I think everybody right now with the Kings is watching to see what's going on with Kevin Fiala. But if you're talking about obviously the players that are on the ice, it's easy to say goaltending, but the Kings actually have 2 goalies, and we think it's going to be Jonas Korpisalo to start the playoffs. That seems the way it's trending, but Phoenix Copley could play significant time as well. So I would, if I'm going to pick one guy, I think I'd have to go with Adrian Kempe. He's been the Kings' leading scorer all year as far as goal scoring. He had a hat trick in their finale against the Ducks to go over 40 goals for the first time in his career. And especially when you go up against teams like the Oilers, where they have those big stars and those guys are going to show up, your big star has to show up as well. He has to lead the way. Now, they've got Andrei Kopitar, they've got Drew Doughty as far as being leaders, but he's kind of that next wave of the next line of players that needs to step up and be a leader. And that doesn't just come with what you say, it comes with what you do, knowing that your team can rely on you in a big moment to score a big goal. He has to be present. He has to be a factor. Adrian Kempe has to score some goals for the Kings to have success.
All right. So, what does a successful playoff run look like for the Kings, and what's at stake if they fall short?
It's a great question because I think going into the season, the Kings made the playoffs last year. Some people thought they were ahead of schedule. The Kings will tell you they were on schedule. It wasn't a surprise. But the next year after you make the playoffs, and especially you took the Oilers to 7 last year, the next step is advancing out of the first round. And yet here they are taking on Edmonton again. And I think everyone would agree that the Oilers are better this year. They're playing better hockey late in the year. So this is going to be a really, really tough test. And I think if you're realistic, you want them to advance out of the first round. That's another step. But if they play a good series and they lose in 7 again to this team, I don't know that anyone's going to think that was all that disappointing. I'm sure everyone in the hockey world is going to pick Edmonton to win this series. So as far as what's at stake if they don't take that next step, honestly, not much. Like I said, they had a great regular season. They finished 3rd in the division to 2 very good teams in Vegas and Edmonton. It's not as if, they lose in the first round that anyone's going to be calling for anyone's head. Todd McClellan is going to be the coach next year. There's not going to be a big turnover as far as the roster goes. The Kings are still a relatively young team with a bright future, and they're going to be adding some good young players next season, like a guy like Brant Clark, who's a great young defenseman in the OHL. So obviously success would be taking that next step. Hopefully that could happen. And if they could beat the Oilers in the first round, like I said, I think that raises the expectations because you think, well, we beat them, we can beat pretty much anyone. But again, if they fall short, I don't think there's going to be many consequences. I think the Kings, when it's all said and done, will say this was a successful season regardless.
Well, the West is wide open, Eddie. So thank you so much. That does it for our Kings preview here on the Locked On Road to the Stanley Cup. Be sure to subscribe to or follow Locked On LA Kings for free on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. The Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.